you. I have 20 minutes to show you that theism is the simplest and therefore most probably true explanation of the most general features of the universe. I hope each of you have a handout. You will need it to follow the argument. Theism purports to be an explanation of the universe and its general features. What's an explanation? There are two patterns of explanation which we use all the time in science, history, and ordinary life. And superficially, they're rather different from each other. There is a pattern that we use in much explanation of inanimate behavior and in science, whereby we explain some event as brought about by some previous state of affairs, its cause, and some law of nature. To take a crude example, if some thing expands, the answer might be as to why it expanded. Well, it was iron and it was heated, and all iron expands when heated. That is to say, cause, iron being heated, law, all iron when heated expands, therefore this expands. Now, of course, science is a little more complicated than that, but there is a view that scientific explanation consists in invoking many sophisticated laws and many complicated initial conditions from which it follows deductively or inductively that the event occurs, and the explanation of the event consists in adducing these laws and initial conditions. But we also have a different way of explaining events, which I call personal explanation. Why are you here this evening? Well, you walked here. Why did you walk here? Well, in order to hear a lecture, and you believed that a lecture would be taking place here. So your presence here is being explained by you, person, having a certain belief that a lecture would be taking place here, a certain purpose of attending the lecture, and certain powers which you have to bring about your presence here by moving your limbs. And we explain all sorts of ordinary events in this way by the actions of persons which they do in virtue of their bodily powers, in virtue of the purposes which they seek to realize, and in terms of the beliefs about how they can realize them. And their purposes are much affected by their general desires, e.g. to improve their knowledge of philosophy, or to take a walk, or whatever it might be. So, here are two patterns of whereby we explain. And the second pattern is, of course, much used not merely in ordinary life explanation, but in historical explanation. But it would be rather surprising if there were two totally different sort of ways through which bring about things. And it rather depends on what you understand by a law of nature, whether these are distinct ways or whether they're rather closer together. So what is it to say that Newton's laws are a law of nature? What does it mean for something to be a law of nature? This is interesting, not a question that scientists very often go into, not a question that polemical scientists such as Dawkins very often go into. But philosophers have had a lot to say about this, and there are three views on the matter. First view is Hume's view, that to say that something is a law of nature is just to say that's the way everything behaves. To say that Newton's laws are laws of nature is just to say that everybody moves as Newton's laws say. But that would leave an enormous problem of why that happens, this enormous coincidence of everything behaving the same way. And there seems to be a necessity about laws. Things don't just move that way, they have to move that way. And that leads to two more slightly different views, according to where you put the necessity, as it were. You can see the necessity as sort of outside objects and controlling the behavior of objects, or you can see it as built into objects. On the first view, laws of nature are sort of platonic realities outside time and space which dictate the behavior of objects within space. That's rather mysterious, that view. I don't think we have a natural desire to, as it were, not postulate things beyond this world unless there's very good reason to do so. And I don't think there is very good reason to do so in this case, because there is an alternative account of laws of nature, which was really the way that the Greeks and the medievals thought about why things behaved the way they did, though they didn't use the phrase laws of nature to describe that way. And on this view, which I call the powers and substances, powers and liabilities view, the view is this, to take my very simple example, to say that all iron expands when heated is just to say that each piece of iron in the universe has a certain power, the power to expand, and the liability to exercise that power when it is heated. That is to say, the necessity by which things behave is built into them in virtue of their causal powers, and they have to exercise it under certain conditions. And if you think that way, then that brings the scientific explanation a little nearer to the personal explanation, because in each case you've got a thing, a substance, as philosophers call it. It might be a person, it might be a chunk of matter. And both the person and the chunk of matter have certain powers. The iron has the power to expand, I have the power to move my limbs. And the difference between these two kinds of explanation then is this, that the inanimate things have an inevitable liability to exercise their powers under certain circumstances, whereas we choose how to exercise our powers in the light of our beliefs and our purposes. And another reason for preferring this second view is when you get down to the really fundamental level, the level of the fundamental particles, it's difficult to see that there is anything more to a fundamental particle than its powers and liabilities. An electron just is the electron it is in virtue of it. It just is an electron in virtue of its mass and its charge. And what is its charge except an ability to repel things with a similar charge and attract things with a different charge? So there are good reasons, and other ones too, I think, for adopting the second model. Okay, so you've got two different ways of explaining things. Now, what is it for an explanation to be probably true? Well, I suggest, and you'll find this on the handout, that an explanation is probably true insofar as if it is true, you find the evidence you do. If it's false, you wouldn't find that evidence. The explanation is a simple one, and insofar as it's concerned with a narrow field, it fits in with what we know in a wider area. Now, let me illustrate how that works for a couple of examples, one of each kind. Suppose I'm a detective investigating a robbery, a safe has been robbed. I have three clues. One is that a suspect, John, was seen near the scene of the crime at the time it was committed. Second clue, that his fingerprints were found on the safe. Third clue, that the money from the robbery was found in his house. On the basis of that, one might say that that's good evidence that he did the job. And certainly the first two criteria would be satisfied in that case. If that he did the robbery is true, then these are the sort of things you might expect, not inevitably, but with a considerable probability. On the other hand, if he didn't do the job, there's certainly no reason to suppose his fingerprints would be on the safe, or that his money would be found in his house. But there are an infinite number of other hypotheses of which these things would be true. Consider this hypothesis. John was near the scene of the crime for some entirely innocent purpose. He was going to see his grandmother. Somebody quite unknown to John was experimenting with putting people's fingerprints on safes that they haven't robbed, and for no particular reason, that person, having no connection with John, managed to lift his prints from somewhere else and put them on the safe. The person who actually did the robbery unfortunately lost the money halfway to his own house, which some stranger picked up and hid in John's house. If this explanation is true, then it would be that the first two criteria are equally well satisfied as in the case of the hypothesis that John did the robbery. But of course, no jury would take that my answer is, and I think it's the obvious answer, the hypothesis that John did the robbery is the simplest hypothesis. Simplest because it only postulates one person doing it, and his actions will lead to those clues, whereas the rival hypothesis postulates three people doing entirely different actions, which in turn lead to those clues. And the same model applies to the most sophisticated scientific theory you could take. Suppose, for example, you think general theory of relativity is true, and that there are certain predictions which it makes and which have been found to come off, which you wouldn't find otherwise, so 1 and 2 are satisfied. But you can have an infinite number of theories of which that is also true. Consider this theory, that general relativity holds until the galaxies are a certain distance apart. When they reach that distance apart, then gravity, instead of being a force of attraction, acts as a force of repulsion, and all the bridges and houses fall to bits. The galaxies reach this distance apart tomorrow, so all the predictions are the same made by the two theories up to today. But of course, we wouldn't go along with the second theory. Why not? Because it complicates things, it brings in an extra factor of when the galaxies are a certain distance apart, which makes it a more complicated theory. My fourth criterion, which I've mentioned, fit with background knowledge, only applies to a rather narrow sort of theory, like the first one I considered, and then you bring in evidence about whether John does this sort of thing on other occasions, and that would be relevant. But in the case of a wide theory, there is no further background knowledge for it to fit with. Now then, simplicity is a matter of postulating only a few substances, the fewer the better. A few kinds of substances, don't postulate more fundamental particles than you have to. A few properties, a few kinds of powers and liabilities, a few kinds of properties, and properties defined in ways close to experience, that is to say in terms that you understand and are familiar with, to the extent to which you can, and which use simple numbers. That is to say, if the theory uses numbers like 0 and 1, then it's going to be a lot simpler than a theory which talks of something to the power 2.7301. And one of the simplest notions, oddly enough, is the notion of infinity, in the sense, not in the sense of an infinite number of things, but in the sense of infinite degree of a property. And an infinite degree of a property is just zero limit to its exemplification. Scientists have always preferred theories with infinity in to theories with very large numbers in when these are equally predictive of the data. One obvious example, once again, would be Newton's theory of gravitation. According to that theory, gravity spread with infinite velocity. That is to say, a little movement here affected things trillions of miles away at the same time. Equally compatible with the data, you could have said that it took 300,000 kilometers a second to get there, and as far as people in the 17th century are concerned, they wouldn't have been able to tell the difference, but infinity was a simpler notion. Right, now, in view of all that, is the theory that theism, the theory that there is a God, is that a simple explanation of the universe? The theory T is as on the bottom of your sheet. God is supposed to be a personal being. What is a person? A person is a being with certain powers, move their arms or whatever, certain beliefs, and certain purposes, which are formed by their desires. So they have inclinations to do things, desires, powers, and beliefs. We are persons in that sense. But we, of course, have finite powers. God is supposed to be limitless in his power. We have some beliefs true, some false, and plenty of things we don't have beliefs about. God is supposed to have all true beliefs, to be omnipotent and omniscient. And God is supposed to be perfectly free in the sense that he is not in any way influenced by desires. We have some desires which influence us, And on the other hand, we see certain things as good to do, and that influences us. But we have views about what is worth doing which are quite out of line with our desires to do things. And therefore, we are subject to irrational desires. God is supposed not to be subject to irrational desires. In that sense, he's perfectly free. Hence, being omniscient, he will see what is good, and having no inclination to do anything else, if you recognize something as good, you have an inclination to do it. So he will inevitably do what is good. So this is a very simple kind of person, unlike us, who are complicated sort of persons in being mixtures of desires for the bad, perceptions for the good, limited powers, and so on. He is a simple person in the sense of my definition. He's one person. He's only got three properties. He's got an infinite degree of each, or rather, as I've described it so far, two properties and one absence of a property. That's to say, he doesn't have desires for irrational ends. How will this explain the universe? Well, God being good will seek to bring about good things. And one particular kind of good thing is you and me, humans. Because we have a kind of goodness that even God himself does not have. We have the goodness to choose between good and evil. God does not have that. He cannot do evil. And God will want there to be such beings. He will be very careful, I'm sure, to make only finite such beings because of the dangers of the evil they might otherwise do. But it's a very good thing for us to have this choice, for things to be up to us, to have responsibility for each other and for the world. And therefore it is natural that God would seek to create beings like ourselves. But if we're to be able to get hold of each other and interact with each other, we need bodies, so he will make a physical universe. If we're to be able to do anything to each other in the world, the universe has to behave in a simple way. I can only grow food if when I sow seeds and water them, plants come up. I can only build buildings if when I put one brick on top of another, it stays there. The universe has to behave in a simple, regular, predictable way, so you would expect there to be laws of nature. And the laws of nature would have to be such as to bring about the existence of human bodies and keep them being, and the initial conditions of the universe would have to be such. So one would expect there to be a universe, a physical universe, governed by simple laws, and these laws to be such, together with the initial conditions of the universe, to lead to the evolution of human bodies. If there is no God, it is extraordinarily unlikely that every atom in the universe would behave in exactly the same way. And just think of the enormous odds against it, unless you've got some explanation of it. But even if it did, it is most extraordinarily odd that it would be productive of human bodies in that sort of way. So, we can talk about the multiverse in the question time. But apart from that, I suggest that the theory of theism, that there is a God, is just the sort of simple theory which satisfies the simplicity requirements that I put on paper. It's absolutely vital. It's not a sort of extra little bit. You couldn't do a bit of science or history or anything without that criterion. It just couldn't make any step beyond the observable data. Absolutely vital in science, history, everywhere else. If you seek to explain the universe, and we certainly ought to, because it's a very regular and enormous thing, God is the simplest explanation by all the criteria that I've put forward. He satisfies all of 1, 2, 3, and 4 is not relevant in this case. And in particular, he satisfies the simplicity criterion by being one being with very simple properties. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Swinburne, and for keeping so precisely in time. I'll now give the floor to Professor Halsey.
I've got two remarks to make. One is that I thought I was responding to Professor Swinburne, so there's a certain amount of disagreed response. Don't get the impression that I'm here to nut Richard. I like him very much. It's just that I thought I was being set up as the foil for him.
So foil I'll be. The other thing is that
This is, I was going to do a PowerPoint presentation because somebody told me 2 years ago that if you don't do PowerPoint presentations, nobody will listen to you and they'll think you're an idiot. But as we've just seen, we've had a wonderful presentation without PowerPoint. I now feel that I'm the one who's going to be judged on this. Anyway, Dawkins and Swinburne, no order implied in that. So can we go to I also don't have control of this, by the way, so could we go to the next one? I just want to start with Dawkins because it's very interesting. I mean, Dawkins was the one who was cited in the programme for this, and of course it's Dawkins' ultimate 747 that was cited. So I just want to have a very brief look at this. It starts with Hoyle. So there's a quote from Dawkins. Hoyle said the probability of life originating on Earth is no greater than the chance that a hurricane sweeping through a scrapyard would have the luck to send to a Boeing 747. Now, this is sort of probabilistic analogue of a law of logic called reductio ad absurdum. Deny what you want to prove, show it leads to an absurdity. And next one, please. This is a probabilistic. The classic design argument for the existence of God is a probabilistic reductio. What we see looks like the work of a designer. Assume there isn't one. Then what we see is must be due to chance. But that's incredibly improbable. I mean, what's the probability of that? Is it's so minute you can't see it. Okay. So Dawkins considers this. He points out that the argument assumes incorrectly that the only alternative to design is chance. But he then claims that in any case, the argument is self-defeating, because what it really shows is the probability of God is negligibly small. So in other words, it works against itself. So here we are. The argument for the statistical improbability properly deployed comes close to demonstrating that God does not exist. My name for the statistical demonstration that God does not exist is the ultimate 747 gambit. However statistically improbable the entity you seek to explain by invoking a designer, the designer himself has got to be at least as improbable. God is the ultimate 747. This is a very, very fishy argument. So, here we go. So, first of all, what do you mean by the statistical improbability of God? The probability of God due to chance is usually what's meant by that. Well, the probability of God by chance is surely zero on any usual understanding of God, because God is usually regarded as the necessitating principle of the universe. So to show that it's very small is hardly an interesting accomplishment. It's equivalent to proving a probabilistic tautology. Okay? I've got 30 slides, 20 minutes, so it's 2/3 of a minute per slide. The argument fails very badly. I think it's pretty obvious it fails very badly. Even if the probability that God was created by chance could be shown in some interesting way to be very small, which it can't be, that would only confirm what every theist believes anyway. Yeah, of course, it's remotely improbable. More importantly, it would tell us nothing about the probability that God exists, given the evidence that we have. So it just doesn't work. It doesn't work in just about every way you want to look at it. But now, the design argument itself is the powerful argument for the existence of God. If you see a very ordered world, okay, it's very, very unlikely statistically that the world would look like that had it not been designed. It sounds a very, very powerful argument. It's also fallacious because it's like the significance test in statistics. If anybody knows what they are, you have a hypothesis which you carefully don't mention. It's about some causal power, and you set up what's called the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis says, well, if this causal thing over there isn't true, then whatever you see must be due to chance. Usually that's very, very unlikely. So you reject the chance, the null hypothesis at a very low significance level, and then you say, okay, well, that's the causal hypothesis must be true. But in this case, rejecting the null, the chance hypothesis does not imply the God hypothesis, because, as Dawkins himself pointed out, and he should have stopped there, those two hypotheses are far from exhausting the explanatory possibilities. It's not true that it's either a designer or it's pure chance. There's an awful lot in between. So can we go to the next one? So this is where we come to Richard, who actually points this out in his very interesting book, The Existence of God. Richard is what's called a Bayesian, and Bayesians do like these probabilistic demonstrations of things. So let G be God exists, as Richard points out, the probability of God, given the evidence we have, depends actually, the crucial thing is, and he mentioned this, it depends likely, so you have a favoured hypothesis, in this case God, how likely is that given the evidence? To compute that, common sense tells you, well, what other ways are there of explaining that evidence? If there are lots of other ways, and they're very plausible, then it's the favoured hypothesis doesn't get very much probability. Okay? So how probable God is, given the evidence, depends on what other possibilities there are. And chance is not the only alternative. Okay, okay, next one. So the probability of God, given the evidence, demands, first of all, if you're going to actually go through this seriously in an objective way, you've got, first of all, got to be able to identify all the possible alternatives to God, and of course chance. You've then got to assess how likely each of those is, and how well explained, how well it explains the data. It's just common sense in formulas, really. Two, you have to assess, as I said, how likely each of these potential explanations is. That's called their prior probabilities. According to Richard, these prior probabilities go by simplicity. The more simple an explanation is, the more likely it is to be true. Okay. I'm doubtful about that. It assumes that simple explanations are more likely to be true. I don't see any reason for that. When I was small, I thought everything was very, very complicated, and I've learned nothing since to convince me otherwise. Richard claims that the history of science shows this. Good ground for believing it. But, you know, what the history of science shows, what the evidence shows, is actually a very ambiguous matter. Because as Hume pointed out 200 years ago, 250 years ago, and as another guy called Goodman pointed out, you can extrapolate evidence in all sorts of ways. Whichever one you want to take as being the favoured one depends on a prior weighting of them, because they all explain the evidence. So, in order to single out one of them, you've got to give it a higher prior weighting. But, in other words, so, you know, using the history of science to justify a thesis about prior probabilities leads to a regress. You know, you've got the same problem with priors. Okay, next one. That's just, doesn't matter about that. Go, next one. Yeah, I believe, let me just say now what I believe. So let's just, the salient points to think of this. There's a hypothesis God. Things that you see are here because they're designed to be here in some way, either immediately or immediately. That's the God hypothesis. And we also have to consider other ways of explaining why things behave as they do. Well, of course, the other way of explaining why things behave as they do is what scientists employ to do for us. So we have to look through all the possible potential explanatory alternatives to the designer hypothesis. Now you try to do that. You try to go through every possible because you've got to do that if you're going to do what Richard wants to do, which is to show that you've got an objective way of assessing the probability that God exists on the evidence, and it's objective. As Richard himself pointed out, with his little example, you've got to look at alternative explanations. How many possible alternatives are there to the designer hypothesis? 1, 2, 3. You can't do it because the space is open. There's no way you can look through that space. Because you don't know what alternative hypotheses, which may come up, which may be very, very satisfying, which may even be very simple and nice, which may be very, very convincing. It may be Weinberg's final theory. There may be lots of final theories, in the sense that they're compact, they're completely they're plausible. The thing that will ultimately decide them, of course, is accumulating evidence which will weed them out. But the fact is that until you know what human theorizing is going to come up with in the future, imagine trying to settle this question 1,000 years ago. Well, you could come, I've no doubt there are people who were around then saying, well, it's objectively clear, you know, that God exists because there's simply no alternative to this. Well, you look back now and you say, well, I mean, well, of course, it's not their fault. I mean, you know, they're 1,000 years ago. Some people look back at us and say, well, and why didn't they have thought of that and that and that and that? And now the fact is, of course, anybody who now looks or reads a book on popular science, the first thing that strikes you is how much more imaginative scientists are than science fiction writers. Science fiction is banal, low level appalling. In terms of imaginative power and the sheer, I was going to say incredibility, but that's actually the wrong word, that these people think of possible ways of explaining what we see, some of them are very bizarre. The fact is they're being thrown up all the time. So if you're going to do what Richard wants, you're going to say, okay, here's the final probability of God given the evidence. I admit, this does mean looking at all the alternatives. All the alternatives is not a well-defined set. You just don't know what's in it. And you can't know what's in it. You can't go through logical space because that logical space hasn't even been defined. It's like the expanding universe itself. Okay? I think I can probably end there. But it's actually a bit early, so I'll go on for a bit longer. It's interesting to see how the objection presents itself quite forcibly when you actually try to carry out such an analysis. You try to think of these various alternatives. Okay. Well, let's start by being clear. This is where I come in as the foils of Richard. Richard's God is an omniscient, omnipotent, all-good, and eternal being. So it's with respect to this august personage that you have to evaluate the data. Does it exist? Okay. So E, the data we have, includes the following information. The universe supports intelligent life. Let's just assume that for the sake of argument. A necessary condition is fine-tuning of some physical constants. This is the famous fine-tuning argument, or phenomenon. Some of the life forms around us have consciousness, a moral and aesthetic sense, and possibly free will. Now, 4. Now that's all very good and you feel noble, and that's tremendous. 4, then. Humanity's lot has on the whole been a mixture of good and evil, but the latter often happening in a way sadly indifferent to the moral character of the sufferer. I shouldn't laugh because actually it's a terrible problem. Okay, next one. So now, let's look at before you consider alternatives to God, let's see how that evidence itself bears on God, in particular the last item. It's called the problem of evil. Now, my belief is that a very powerful argument against the God, Richard's God hypothesis, it's got nothing to do with the present alternative explanations. It's just that God is a terribly bad explanation for what we see, namely, and summed up really in the problem of evil. It's virtually inconsistent with it. Okay. Now, there are all sorts of theologians and other people, I'm sure, will tell you that, there are all ways of explaining this, yes, they'll cite things like witnessing tragedy, visit upon the innocent deepens our sense of shared humanity. It's a good exercise for our moral faculties, generally makes us feel better, purges us, or whatever. But it seems to me, I think, that to inflict evil on the innocent, simply to achieve an end like that, seems wicked and petty, and being wicked and petty doesn't really square very well with this very, very big, omniscient, all-good person. It seems inconsistent with it. So I knock the God hypothesis right down on that part of the evidence. But, next one. Nevertheless, it's a fact, many people don't agree with that. Okay? And not only that, there are other parts of that evidence that seemed to point almost as strongly towards the designer. Yeah? And one of those, of course, is the fine-tuning problem. So let's have a look at the fine. Can we... Okay. This is the fact that there were various constants, not the way that they seem to be, these constants seem to be in a very small interval of their joint values. Hang on. Okay, that's all right. Okay. Now, that's to be expected. It's a necessary condition of life that these things lie in that small. It's not just they lie there, it's just that life, carbon-based life, intelligent life wouldn't be possible if they didn't. So the universe seems to have been designed, fine-tuned for our existence. Hang on, could you? Yeah. Well, the first thing to notice, actually, is that you can have life in a way without, you can have intelligent life, presumably without it being carbon-based. I mean, there are various... that it has to be carbon-based is predicated on a lot of existing theory. But God, is only bounded by logical possibility. Why can't God conceive of all sorts of other life forms which are intelligent and do all this sort of knocking each other on the head and other people feeling sad and other people feeling good? No reason why not. So think of all the possible ways in which somebody bounded only by logical possibility could get life games, like Conway's game of life. I mean, he's Selinor Thomas doing these various things or whatever. Well, that seems to be probably infinite in many ways. It's very difficult to say. If there are infinite many different ways, then the probability of this particular way is very, very small. So in other words, this isn't so probable, given God, at all. It's minutely improbable, because of all the other ways it could have happened. Okay. Next one. The other thing about this is that there's a technical problem with what's called chance. There are different ways of representing these. There are different numerical ways of representing these constants. And the fine-tuning is actually rather highly variable. This is a technical, we don't need to go into that next one. But the fundamental objection is, of course, that we go back to the beginning again. Chance is not the only alternative to design. There may be lots of other theories out there may be infinitely many, that in the sort of way that Weinberg and Einstein thought there should be, there will be very nice, non-arbitrary final theories that will explain these constants. You just don't know. So we come back, this is where we come back again, to what are the alternatives to design and chance. You've got to look through logical space and you've got to find them all, and if you're going to do what Richard wants to do, you've got to find all of them, and you've got to assess their prior probabilities. But it's an open space. There's no way you can do it. The search is endless, in principle. Okay. Yeah, okay, next one. Well, I just know that, what we see is that, we have these... The membership of this space, alternatives, depends on our own conceptual categories. As we all know from the history of science, these are subject to very radical overhaul, revolution, what have you. So there is really no way of knowing, what sorts of things we will, How our knowledge is going to develop, we don't know. How our theorising is going to develop, we don't know. There's just no way. In other words, it's just a sort of an addendum to my claim that logical space can't be plumbed, can't be fathomed. It's a terra incognita that can't be mapped. So you can't get a final prior probability of G because you can't have all these other possibilities. No, that one. No, not that. Yeah, this is a little bit of rhetoric. A mappable terra incognita. As Wittgenstein, I'd like to come back to Wittgenstein because he was at Cambridge and he's buried not far away. What about the possibilities you can't conceive? There may be possibilities about however far human theorising goes, however far the human conceptual apparatus can deal with things, however much you can invent machines that will then push this further on. There may still be things in God's world that are inconceivable. Who knows? But inconceivable by us, with all our sort of peripherals and things like that. As Wittgenstein famously remarked, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. So what we can do, now that we come back to Richard again, you can start try and preempt what we mean by explanation. Okay, there are all these possible things. Richard says, well, I think Richard says this, well, they may be just natural laws, that's not inconsistent with God, I don't know, and some of the people a lot of the people, working scientists do, they put it under this head, this is all under the heading of not God, so they don't believe in the designer. So let's see what else we can do. Is it possible to get sort of ultimate laws that satisfy everybody according to certain inner criteria of harmony, consistency, simplicity, and non-arbitrariness? Well, of course, we can name the names in the history of science. Dirac, Einstein, Weinberg, lots and lots of people think that a final theory is in effect God. If you look at, I think I'm just going to leave the slides now, so let's just, as a sort of final word, because I'm now getting quite close to the end, what's really the difference between, say, Richard's God and perfectly formed, harmonious final theory. The difference between that and God consists in one thing. One of them cares about us, and the other one doesn't. As Einstein said, that sort of God doesn't care a jot about human beings. Okay, now look at that last item in the data, the problem of evil. Which one do you think is better supported? I leave that to you. Okay?
Okay, thank you very much indeed to both speakers for getting us off to a great start. We're now going to turn to the interlocutors. There will be an opportunity for both main speakers to come back later on. But we're going to go straight to our three interlocutors and just to introduce them in the order in which they'll make a few comments and then also ask one or two questions. And we've got Reverend Dr. Patrick Richmond, who was former Dean of the Chapel at St. Catherine's College. We've got Professor Michael Velker, who's the Professor of Systematic Theology at Heidelberg, and he's here on sabbatical during this term. And then we've got the Reverend Dr. Rodney Holder, who's course director at the Faraday Institute, also a cosmologist and an expert, as it happens, also on Bayesian probability. So I'll hand over to Patrick to give us his comments. Thank you.
I was impressed to see that the non-simple numbers that Dennis was writing down as he timed out our planned things as we spoke suggested that I didn't have very long. So I'm going to challenge your powers of perception. Some of you may have seen the collar I'm wearing and concluded to the simplest interpretation of that I'm not unbiased. But I'm going to try and defend Richard Dawkins, who got short shrift from both our speakers a bit. It seems to me that we've got the question of simplicity. Does it give us some guide to what's the best explanation? And even more strongly than that, does simplicity give us a guide to truth? And we've got the question of the simplicity of God. And interestingly, I think that Professor Dawkins and Professor Swinburne are quite close together on the first question, the value of simplicity. Richard Dawkins, as the Professor of the Public Understanding of Science, wants us to think that science is on the track of truth. And he does commend simple explanations. He even commends Professor Swinburne for seeing that simple explanations are good ones. He just thinks that he slips on an amazing banana skin when he says that God is simple. So Professor Swinburne and Professor Dawkins, I think, are both saying that simplicity does give us some guide to truth. Maybe not to absolute truth, but as we do science, we are making progress. And the science that we have today, while not perfect, is a lot better than it was in the past. And though Professor Howson rightly points out all the difficult philosophical problems about exploring the possibility space of all possible theories, nonetheless, we should think that science is doing quite well. And in many ways, it does seem to me that science is doing quite well. And if we do agree that simplicity is of value in theory choice, then we're able to dismiss some of the more sceptical hypotheses that someone like David Hume proposed as alternatives to the God hypothesis. So that Hume suggests, well, maybe there are many gods, or there's a committee, or there's some junior deity, and this universe is just the botched result of his early experiments. And we'll also hear from the multiverse. I'll leave this more to Rodney, as he's an expert on that. But what I want to point out now is that if we think simplicity is a real guide to truth, then we may be able to dismiss some of these ideas of many gods or committees or junior deities or multiverses on the grounds that they're not so simple. The God that Professor Swinburne is defending is a simple God and therefore a superior ultimate explanation, a better place to stop the quest for explanation, a more likely to be true explanation for what we see. So simplicity can help the theist. But Professor Dawkins, I think, wants to say that whatever theists, believers in God, have said about God in the past, it just isn't plausible. I think that Professor Dawkins does realise, at least in some moments, that traditionally God has been described as absolutely simple and as logically necessary. It can't fail to exist. But I think that Professor Dawkins thinks that both those claims are absurd on the face of it. He doesn't seem to give much much explanation for his belief that God must be complicated, and I think that must be because he thinks it's just obvious that God must be complicated. He thinks that God must be more in need of an explanation than the things he's meant to explain, because I think he thinks that God must have either something like a central processing unit or a brain, as in the case of intelligence that we find in human beings or artificial intelligence, or I wonder whether he thinks that God must just have an amazing collection of ideas. He must have in his mind all the ideas of possible universes he could create, and that would seem to be infinitely many. So you would seem to have an infinitely complex thing. Although Professor Swinburne is saying that God is simple because he's just one substance, that substance would have to be amazingly complex mentally, because it has all of these ideas in it. And it seems to me that that idea pops up again and again. And when I tried this out on theological students who were applying to come to Cambridge, indeed they were worried by this. They weren't convinced by it, but they could see that God didn't seem obviously simple. So I think that something needs to be said there. But even if we leave simplicity aside, it's interesting that Professor Dawkins doesn't think that the problem of evil can be pressed so conclusively as Professor Howson does. So it shows how difficult it is to argue with these atheists because they can't agree amongst themselves. But it seems finally to me that even if we leave simplicity aside, many people may wonder which seems the more satisfying place to stop explanation. Is it with God or is it with some other unknown? Now, it does seem to me that many people find it intuitively attractive to stop explanation with a mind making a decision. But when you think about it in a scientific way, you may be more tempted to think, well, wow, intelligence really is just the sort of thing I want to explain. No way could I stop there. So I think that people's fundamental intuitions about what an ultimate explanation should look like do differ, and they may differ partly on your exposure to science, and particularly neuroscience. So I'm going to stop there.
Thanks very much indeed. I think we'll hand over to Michael Albert to make a few comments on the bill, so ask a question if you wish.
I'd like to thank you very much for your kind invitation to join this stimulating panel discussion. I wonder, however, whether I'm really the conversation partner you were looking for. With my background as a Protestant systematic theologian from Germany, certainly involved in the dialogue with philosophy and science, but also very much in the dialogue with Jewish and Christian biblical exegesis, from which I cannot easily abstract. My problem, and thus unfortunately yours as well, is that I have pretty much made up my mind with regard to Richard Dawkins' recent publications after a careful reading of his God illusions, and do not have many open questions to his thinking. Perhaps equally bad, I have from my theological background considerable difficulties to go along with some very basic assumptions in Richard Swinburne's writings. In my opinion, Richard Dawkins plunges into a plain anti-religious, scientistic and naturalistic fundamentalism. And I can only echo some of his thoughtful critics. His main argument against what he calls a supernatural universe-creating intelligence seems to be that such an intelligence, or such a God, I quote him, would have to be very, very complex and presumably irreducibly so. Alistair McGrath has rightly challenged Dawkins' double leap from stating extremely high complexity to the assertion of improbability, and then from improbability to non-existence. As McGrath puts it, we may be highly improbable, yet we are here. From the bottom-up perspective, it has been argued that Dawkins cannot really consistently pursue his materialistic and naturalistic reductionism. To keep his theory up, he needs many teleological, aesthetical and moral considerations, so to speak, from the outside, which accordingly he introduces. Dennis Noble has in a subtle way recently corrected Dawkins' belief that, I quote Dawkins, the genes created us, body and mind, and he says, we are the ultimate rationale for their existence. Despite more media noise, I cannot but find Dawkins' position inconsistent, and I'm afraid ultimately boring. This said, I wish I could defend Professor Swinburne's position more wholeheartedly against Dawkins' sharp critique. Whenever I read Professor Swinburne's text in the past, I was very much impressed by his masterful combination of 18th century Anglican natural theology and 20th century probabilistic logic. However, so far I have failed to see that the type of theism he proposes possesses an optimum of explanatory power. For in my view, this type of theism seems to be burdened with a severe religious moral atrocity. Connected with this, I cannot regard this model as bearing a convincing argument for the simplicity of God. Swinburne defends a notion of an absolute divine omnipotence, which, if Dawkins and I read him correctly, gives God a strange cosmomorphic and mechanical touch indeed, and evokes the impression of an ubiquitous, simple divine causal creativity. In Dawkins' words, Swinburne's, I quote Dawkins, God constantly keeps a finger on each and every particle, curbing its reckless excesses and whipping it into line with its colleagues to keep them all the same. End of quote. I wish I could say that this description is not just a caricature, but definitely a wrong picture. And I'm really very open to learn from the further discussion. I would wish even more that I could defend Professor Swinburne against the impression that he attributes an ultimately moral cynicism to God when he writes, I quote from The Existence of God, suppose that one less person had been burnt by the Hiroshima atomic bomb, then there would have been less opportunity for courage and sympathy. Similar remarks appear in his writings with regard to the Holocaust, the tsunami, and other atrocities and catastrophes. I see Professor Swinburne's position trapped in a non-biblical understanding of God's omnipotence and a questionable connection of truth and simplicity, which gives rise or even provokes a sharp agnostic critique, such as of Dawkins's. In short, Dawkins and Swinburne almost appear to me to be intellectual twin brothers in a dualistic love-hate relationship. I would find it a great relief if the ongoing discussion could prove my perception wrong.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, it's not only atheists who apparently disagree with each other, so that's good to know. I think we'll go straight to Rugby Holder. I think what we're going to do when Rugby's made a few comments is we're going to come back to, briefly, to each of our main speakers to just respond a little bit. I think that would be only fair before we open the floor to everybody. So, over to you, Rugby Holder.
Well, thank you for the excellent presentations. On Sunday morning, I actually engaged in an exercise of inductive inference. I was interviewed about this very event by Radio Cambridge. And one has to act in the real world, one has to make decisions, one has to predict the future. And I said that I thought Professor Swinburne would defend the doctrine of divine simplicity and would argue that that was the best explanation for the existence of the universe. That Professor Howson would say that, well, we can't really get a handle on simplicity or any of these criteria at all, and indeed we simply can't decide this thing on the basis of probability at all. Now, I don't think what I did there is a problem for Professor Swinburne. It's more of a problem for Professor Howson, possibly. I mean, it's only a fun example, really. But it seems to me, from Professor Howson's point of view, that taking humans on, that we have a problem about science and about induction per se in science. And the kinds of arguments that Professor Howson has offered, that you have to examine the whole logical space and so on. Well, of course, that applies to science too, and in his book he comes up with some extremely pathological examples of how the future might evolve, with demons and so on ruining this general pattern that we observe, so that we can't predict the future on the basis of the past. So there is a problem, it seems to me, if we move away from this the kind of objective criteria of Professor Swinburne. Before coming to Professor Swinburne, just a few words about, well, I have to say something about Dawkins, I think. But it seems to me that Dawkins, I think we all disagree with Dawkins really, but he's got multiple problems. He says that the hypothesis to explain the world needs to be, or to explain organised complexity, it must be more complex itself than what it's explaining. Well, he has a theory of evolution, which seems to me to be a very simple theory, which does the explaining. So it's not clear that an explanation has to be more complex than what's being explained. even if that applies to an agent, then it's not clear to me that I can't design something that's got more parts than me and is organised in a more complex way than me. So I think Dawkins has got some problems there. And Dawkins also tells us that we should only believe things on the basis of evidence, and then of course he does believe in a multiverse for which there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever. It seems to me because he's frightened of the kind of argument that Professor Swinburne puts forward, that theism explains why the universe exists and why it's so special. Dawkins actually has no explanation of that, putting God versus evolution as opponents, of course, isn't doing that at all, because, well, what evolution? Now, that doesn't mean to say that there aren't problems with Professor Swinburne's approach as well. And I think they do relate to nailing this idea of simplicity, perhaps, very tightly, and indeed comparing God with a physical universe is not an easy thing to do. You are comparing chalk with cheese when you say that one is probable and another is highly improbable. And then there are the questions of these infinities, which Professor Swinburne said, well, a complex number of things, infinite number of things is complex, but not an infinite degree of a power. Well, is it infinitely many watts of energy, or there may be some issues surrounding that. In my own approach, I've largely followed Professor Swinburne, but I am concerned about some of the problems of putting probability distributions onto parameters and so on, such as Professor Housen said is very difficult. Indeed, it is. But I've really rather taken my cue from scientists who tend to use the principle of induction, who tend to say that simpler explanations are more likely to be true, and for whom the fine-tuning problem is something that's come out of science itself and seems to need an explanation from within science. So perhaps my approach, being largely following Professor Swinburne, is a bit more pragmatic in trying to follow the way that scientists themselves actually.
Thank you very much indeed to our three interlocutors. I think what we'll do now is just give 3 minutes, if that's, I'm afraid, 3 minutes max to both of our main speakers, and then we're going to throw the floor open for general discussion. Maximum 3 minutes, please. Just to respond to whatever you find.
Well, when Dennis first invited me to this symposium, he said, we don't want a general discussion about the existence of God, we want a really focused discussion on the notion of simplicity. But I find my objectors raising the problem of evil. Now, I think there is a satisfactory theodicy, that is to say, a reason why a good God would allow evil of the kind and amount with which we are familiar in our universe. But I cannot do that in 3 minutes. But I make no apology for saying that I think that a good God delegates responsibility for humans to look after each other, and he gives us a pretty long leash, but not an infinite leash. And I think that a good God is certainly going to allow the Holocaust. If 6 million people over the course of many centuries are going to make wrong choices, that's where it ends up. And so many people made so many bad choices that they were allowed to make, that is where it ended up. And what people who say that God shouldn't have allowed things to get quite as bad as that are saying is that God shouldn't trust us with each other. And I think that God should trust us with each other quite a lot, up to that amount at least. And I make no apology for that. We could have another session on the problem of evil. But coming back to the subject of today, Colin says there are an infinite number of possibilities of which we have not thought. Quite certain how he knows that, but he suggested that anyway. Alas, the same criticism would apply to any scientific theory at all. We are led to believe that quantum theory is true. There is a lot of evidence of it. But the there are an infinite number of ways in which this might be, the data might be explained, many of which are, of course, less simple than quantum theory. But who knows, among all the theories we haven't thought of, there may be some that are a lot simpler. And if that's right, then we have no reason at all to expect that the predictions of quantum theory tomorrow will come out right, because the true theory may have quite different consequences for tomorrow. And in that case, if that's really our situation, we have no reasonable knowledge of what will happen tomorrow. But of course, we do think we have reasonable knowledge of what will happen tomorrow. And that's because we do think we have some notion of the possibilities of theories, what kinds of possible theories there might be, and which of them might be simpler than other ones. Now, of course, we may be mistaken about this, but the point I'm making is one shouldn't suppose there to be an infinite range of theories we haven't thought of, which it's quite reasonable to suppose might be a lot simpler than the ones which we in fact know about. If that were true, we might as well give up science. And I did, in my writings, and Colin has kindly looked them over, consider a number of alternative theories for the universe, not merely the hypothesis of many weaker gods and so on, but since the only kinds of hypotheses we are aware of are the ones that fit, that we can conceive of, are the ones that fit the two patterns that I mentioned, I considered the possibility that perhaps the universe might have evolved out of one single substance. That is to say, you might regard the Big Bang, if that's the beginning of the universe, as somehow the source of all the powers that are subsequently possessed by electrons, protons, and so on. And you might think of it as a real singularity, not just a very compressed substance. But if you did, you would still have to attribute to it far more complicated properties than you attribute to God. You would have to attribute to it the property of producing just a few finite kinds of things, electrons, protons, and so on, which had themselves the powers of producing a few more finite kinds of things, and only the power to do that, and the power to do that of a very particular, mathematically precise kind. And therefore, a priori, why should it be of that particular kind? You're only going to get a reason, other than just a particular number, a reason why it should be of that general kind as to be human producing, if there is an agent acting for the sake of the good. And that's where the theism hypothesis, its simplicity comes out, because you don't have to put in particular finite values of constants into it. You only have to suppose an agent acting for the sake of the good, and therefore producing this unique kind of goodness that we have. And any way by which you would do it, he's not necessarily confined to carbon-based life in order to do it, but mere postulating that will give you what you've got, and that is far simpler than the rival physical hypothesis with all the numbers in.
Thank you very much, Colin.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think I've been so slightly unfairly belabored here, because I don't for 1 minute think you can't do induction, and I fully believe that things will go on as they've been going on. Richard Swinburne said that what he's doing is an objective assessment of probability. If you're only an objective assessment of probability, I'm a subjectivist. I mean, I do hunches, I put prior probabilities on things. Sometimes they come out true, sometimes they don't, but this is what most people do. Richard wants to be an objectivist. And if you want to be an objectivist, I'm afraid that's what you're stuck with. It's no good saying, well, we've got a few theories here, they seem to do very well. Let's not worry about all the other things we haven't thought of. No, if you want to be objective, that's exactly what you've got to do. Now, I'm not objectivist. I'm a subjectivist. I don't care anyway. But, don't hit me with that stick, because, he's the one who wanted objectivity. I don't. So that's one thing. I believe in induction. All the way. As for quantum mechanics, I'm not sure that any scientist really believes that quantum mechanics is true. I strongly doubt it. Otherwise, why they're trying to go on to find theories that allow quantum mechanics to be reconciled with general relativity. I just don't think that's true. But I could stand to correct you on that if I'm wrong. Dawkins, in defence of and against Dawkins, I think Dawkins is getting a very easy ride with it, he doesn't deserve. But he did point out one thing that's true, which is that if A explains B, then the probability of B, forget about complexity, that's a red herring. If A explains B, the probability of A is less than or equal to the probability of B, and that follows from the laws of probability. So if God explains the evidence, then God has a probability at most as great as the evidence, so it's less than or equal. So he's quite correct there. Okay, so it's wrong to say that, he's gone wrong. That wasn't a full step at all. What was false is saying that if you take the statistical model of the evidence, that's very improbable, and therefore on that same model, God must be at least as improbable. But only if you take a statistical model of the evidence. And as I said, chance is not the only way of explaining things other than a designer, and that's the fallacy of Dawkins. Okay. Where are we now? Oh yes, I'm still not convinced about the problem of evil. I think even if Richard has forever and a day, I think he'd be hard put really to convince me that a caring, loving, good God would let things happen as they do. And I'm going to just end my little spiel with a remark by Woody Allen, which was, I don't want to offend anybody here, I just take this as an amusing remark, with friends like God, who needs enemies.
Okay, so we're going to have some overtime for question Q&A now. We haven't got so much time, I'm afraid. But can you just keep your questions brief? Please talk about simplicity and complexity. We're not going to get onto the theology anymore. We've done that. So, first question, thank you. And please say who you want to address it to, if it's particularly to Professor Swinburne or Professor Halsey.
Specifically, Professor Swinburne.
Yes. Can you just wait till you get the mic? Sorry, there's a mic coming on. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. So, there's been a lot of talk about simplicity, right? But my understanding of scientific theory is sometimes just that there's no simple. I wouldn't even consider a theory. I wouldn't even consider it a theory if someone didn't come and tell me how it was falsifiable. Otherwise, it doesn't really explain anything. A God that could explain the world with the Holocaust, without the Holocaust, carbon-based life form, non-carbon-based life form. So what is it that's falsifiable about your theory? Do you not regard that as important, or are you going to tell me, if such and so happens tomorrow, I'll stop believing in God?
I certainly regard it as important that there may be things which count for or against the theory. I very much doubt if any scientific theory of any sophistication is ever completely falsifiable, because the theory will have many parts to it and many theories about how its instruments work and so on, and you can always avoid the apparently falsifying instance by twiddling one of these minor components. But to do so would be to make the theory less simple and therefore less likely to be true. So I think to insist on total falsifiability is to ask a lot of any scientific theory or any theory at all. But having said, what you are saying to me is there anything which I would regard as making it extremely improbable that there is a God? And the answer is certainly yes. I mean, if I were shown good evidence that somebody would suffer for an infinite number of years, not through their own choice, I would regard that as conclusive evidence against the existence of God. Why I don't think the evil in the world is of that character is because we only live for a very small time, and that is sufficient to allow a satisfactory theodicy to explain that evil.
Thank you. The next question will be for Professor Halsey. Please. Yes. Yes. Yeah. I said that's what he's admitted to, Richard's admitted to.
That's right, but you think that's false. But surely we have some idea how many simple explanations there are. After all, if there's an explanation which cannot be given in English in space less than the Encyclopedia Britannica, it's not a simple explanation. So if we're assigning explanations on the basis, if we're assigning probabilities on the basis of simplicity, such an explanation is improbable. And there are only so many explanations that you can give in the space of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Could it be that if we work things out carefully, we'll actually find that things sum up and do give some kind of an answer?
Once language evolves, I mean, what may take a long time to express now, or a short time to express now, may be reversed in the future. You don't know. I mean, the theory of fields, for example, is a very simple way of talking about the multiplicity of particles. Because they're not really, I would call it one view of field theory, is they're not particles at all, they're just excited states of fields. So here you've got suddenly this lovely way of reducing the complexity of... So go back before people thought of fields. Suppose they knew about the particles, but they didn't know about the fields. I mean, so you get amazing sort of myriads of stuff going on here. Well, you could actually reduce it. They're just simply excited states. So you've got a way, and you don't know what's going to happen. There may be... Maybe the blueprint is incredibly simple. It just uses a highly refined vocabulary, a high-level machine language. You know, take the computing analogy. I mean, the machine language, zeros and ones, are incredibly complicated. But we're high-level people, so we can write things down very simply. You know, it might be like that. Who knows? I mean, who knows?
Okay. Any questions broadly across the panel that can be directed towards... Yes.
But I really wanted to press time a bit, because it sounds to me as though your argument isn't actually to do with God at all. Because you're saying that you can't get objective probability of God because there may be many, many other explanations. But the same logic would be that you can't get an objective probability of the existence of elephants or anything like that. Isn't God a red herring to your argument? And conversely, if you can use these kinds of arguments that Professor Swinburne is using for anything, then you haven't given an argument as to why you can't use them for God.
So I actually missed I think there's a crucial bit of that I actually missed. You couldn't just go with the last bit again, because it's the...
Your argument against Professor Swinburne's logic is that instead of comparing God with randomness, you should compare God with all other possible explanations.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Because that set is not fully known.
Yeah.
You can't do the comparison.
Yeah.
But if your argument's valid, then that argument applies if you substitute any other hypothesis other than God.
Yeah.
And therefore your argument's actually got nothing to do with the question of the existence of God at all.
Yeah. Yes, quite right.
Good.
Yeah. No, nothing whatever. No. But it's again, I think I'm bearing the cross that Richard should really bear, if you don't like the analogy, which is that I never set out to have any sort of objective way of doing this, but Richard did, and his books full of things like, we need an objective assessment of this has got to be fully objective. If you're going to be objective, then it just seems to me you're forced. You can't just cut off a whole realm and say, I don't know what's in that, I don't really care. I'm quite satisfied with what little bit I got here. That's subjectivism. I'm a subjectivist. I can do that. I don't mind it. And I agree with everybody else who says that's the rational thing to do. But Richard wants to be fully objective. And I think if you're going to be fully objective, then whether you like it or not, that's what you're facing.
Okay, question for Richard Swinburne, please. Up the top here, if you can get the mic there. You know the show.
You do.
No, we want to record it.
I am actually a scientist, and so I'm kind of amused by the different descriptions of...
Spelling it, yeah, if you can put it in the mic, that'd be great. Yeah, thanks.
Does this work?
Yep.
Okay. I was actually amused by the description of laws, and the idea that, for example, that ion expands as a law of nature struck me as somewhat antiquated. Nowadays, we would say that really fundamental law are things like the principle of least action and the increase of entropy. And these are, in fact, very abstract. And I think a scientist would regard them as simple, but in order to explain them to most people, you probably would need most of the Encyclopedia Britannica. So I was desperately searching for a difference between the points of view here, and I could only really find one, and that's the following, that the people here who have some appreciation for science at no point claim to know the answers to anything. But I get the impression that Professor Swinburne does know all the answers. He knows about God. He knows what God can and can't do. He can't do evil. He can do this, that, and the other. How on earth do you know that?
Firstly, of course, I apologise for the simplicity of the original example about iron, and I made that point at the time. It's just it takes longer time even to spell out Newton's laws than it does to say that, and I think the point could be made by the hyper-simple example. But what you are accusing me of doing is purporting to know the answers, whereas scientists don't know the answers. Now, what scientists know the answers about? Science? If so, we come back to this problem which a number of people have been raised. Come, really. You think certain theories are going to give good predictions tomorrow and others aren't. If you didn't think that, you wouldn't build bridges which rely on them, you wouldn't send people to the moon which rely on them, and so on. It's because you think these theories are, at any rate, to a very high degree of approximation, that you probably true, that you rely on them. And I have been investigating the criteria which you are using, which any scientist is using in reaching this verdict. And I suggest they are the criteria which I've summarized on the handout. I am then suggesting that rational people ought to use the same criteria when they are dealing with other matters. They are the criteria we use in history and ordinary life, detectives use. We ought to use those criteria here in investigating the even bigger questions than the ones which scientists ask. That is to say, why have we got laws of nature and why are they of that particular kind? And if I do ask that question, and if I do use these criteria, they give me the answer which I have suggested to you. I am just following the rational, believing in science as I do, and operating with the criteria which seem to me to operate in science. I am just applying it to the most general phenomena, and that's the answer they give.
Okay, we could go on a huge amount of time with this, and I'd love to do that, but I'm afraid our time is really up, and I know some people have to get away. I just want to do two things really in closing. The first is to thank our main speakers and the whole panel for their really great contribution.